Welcome to the Ambitious Introvert podcast, created especially for introverts, empaths, and highly sensitive entrepreneurs to help you build, grow, and scale a successful, sustainable business. I'm your host, Emma-Louise Parks, business and mindset coach for ambitious introverts. After 17 years working as an air traffic controller, the ultimate fast-paced, high-stimulus, extrovert-friendly role, my mission now is to show introverts that they too can create big results and success because of who they are, not in spite of it. I focus on introvert-friendly business and marketing strategy to help you switch overwhelm for clarity, confidence, and clients. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ambitious Introvert podcast. And I have not touched on a more body-based, a more kind of, physical aspect of sensitivity, introversion for a while. We've been very focused on business guests and mindset, which is great. But I'm really thrilled today to actually move a little bit away from that and focus on our sensitivity, whether it's innate, whether it's natural to us, how we feel about it, and maybe look into it in some ways that we hadn't really thought about before. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by today's guest, Jessi. I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and your business.
Oh, thank you so much, Emma. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessi Michel Agadoni, and I have a practice called Mercilor Wellness that specializes in helping natural sensitives find their calm and their resiliency once again so that they can build sustainable health. And ironically, I work actually with a lot of sensitives in the business world. I don't even think we talked about this, Emma, but that is kind of like a accidental side passion is helping specifically sensitives in business, but through health. Because how can you be successful in business? How can you have that beautiful resiliency and grit to move through the ups and downs if you don't have your body, if you don't have your health? So that is my passion. That is my work. And I specialize specifically in sensitives that are born sensitive. And I know we're going to talk about this, Emma, but I actually coined a term because I'm wild like that. I like to make up my own language sometimes when I don't feel like there's words that quite capture the essence of something. And, we're commonly known as highly sensitive people, right? And then we kind of wrap in introversion in there and empathy and many other terms. And there's so much debate on who's who and all of that, which I think is so silly. But at the end of the day, I think there is a big difference between someone that is innately sensitive, so born sensitive, and someone that actually has developed sensitivity. Obviously, both are something to navigate and have equal value, but it can have a different impact on your life. And so my specialty is actually those that are born sensitive and have something called sensory processing sensitivity. It's a trait that's been studied now over the last 2 decades, which is really exciting, but it's very fresh. It's very new, especially to the scientific community. And then definitely it's making its way into therapy and the psychiatry world and things like that, but it hasn't quite made its way into the health world. So I'm kind of like bringing it in. And so I actually decided to rename it. And instead of going by highly sensitive person, I actually call it natural sensitivity. So I would call someone a natural sensitive that has been born with that sensitivity. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
I love it. And it's so true. And I've had this back and forth with clients, and a number of my clients also work with sensitives in different areas. And the first thing is that some people just don't associate themselves with the word sensitive. And that's certainly my story. I picked up Dr. Aaron's book because I thought it would be beneficial for a friend. Never in a million years did I see, because to me, sensitive meant emotional. Sensitive meant you overreact to all of that. It's such a loaded word, I think, in some ways. And especially when you add highly in front of it. And it's like, whoa, you're like highly sensitive. And
it's like honestly, a bomb.
Right?
People are like, oh my gosh, you're a ticking time bomb. I don't want to be around you. And it's like, oh, it's
and
so,
I would
it's so
never
sad.
have self-identified as highly sensitive at all. And then I read it and I took the quiz and I scored I don't even know, like the quiz is out of 28 or something. I scored 24 and I was like, okay, this makes a lot of sense.
Oh, I guess this applies.
Yeah. So that was just an aside, but I can totally see why, like you say, with given a term to something that kind of neutralizes it and talks about it more as being an innate trait rather than a negative aspect of yourself, right?
Exactly. And I think for me, I would say it's a tone, right? Because I think it's actually important. It's really important to identify this if you have it. I think we all go through seasons where we love labels and seasons where we don't love labels, right? And I think there's a balance there of you never want a label to limit you, right? If you ever find that it's preventing you from being your most authentic self, from being your best self, then toss it, for however long you need to. But ultimately, if this is something that you are, that is never going to shift per se, I call it turning the volume up and turning the volume down as far as the intensity of it. But it's there. It's who you are. And I think it's important for us to understand that, because those that are innately sensitive, natural sensitives, need to live differently in order to be healthy. And I would say to extend that in order to be successful in business. And I know you know that. So if we don't know that, we're going to keep hitting up against a brick wall and getting frustrated and discouraged and depressed and anxious, and then find ourselves with chronic autoimmune disease and different things like that. Like, that's my world, right? And that's what I see time and time again. And it's simply because we're trying to be someone that we weren't literally created and wired to be. Like, at the cellular level, we are meant to live differently. And then 80% at minimum of the population, which is a big shift, a really big shift. And I'm from, Southern California in the US, and we're pretty intense over here when it comes to business and even health, I would say, and movement and all of this. And yet it's so vital to differentiate what healthy, what successful, what, being your best self looks like within this culture. So it's really, really big. Whether you want to take the label on or not, I think it's important to at least understand if this is a trait you have, right? And that's why I love the term natural sensitive, is because it does remove the negativity around it that so many of us have. I felt the same way. I grew up having that word targeted at me as a negative, because the undertone when someone said, oh, you're so sensitive or you're too sensitive was actually more what I heard. The language behind that was, there's something wrong with you. You're too weak. I don't want you on my team. Get it together. Like, this is not normal. Even potentially like you're mentally unstable, like all those things, when it actually is not true. So, and that, again, there's a lot of nuances in that, right? With the sensitive journey, I talk a lot about the difference between innate and then developed. And I can dive into that more if you want. But yeah, there's so much value in really embracing sensitivity. And so for me, it required a change of vocabulary. It required a little shift in the term. And I'm noticing a lot of people responding really, really well to it, of like, oh yeah, thank you. That feels good. Because natural, it's like, oh, well, it's just there, and also like I'm more holistically based. I love natural things. So it fits, but it's also just who you are. Like, that's just who you are. And then the sensitivity is just paired with that, as opposed to highly just feels, like you said, this heightened, like, oh my gosh, like it's so intense. And so it just has a negative tone to it. And I know Dr. Elaine Aron never intended that. I respect her so much. I love her work. So this new term is not meant to pull away from that. It's meant to add on to it. It's meant to bring more people into the fold in a way, to find her work and to feel comfortable with it. So I hope that it just adds to the community and provides some more clarity too.
I totally get that. And I think, I'm very into language. I'm an NLP practitioner. I studied English and psychology, I love language. Yeah. And the nuance of language, like you say, it's not anything to do with what Dr. Aron coins the term, but it's sometimes to do with the energy behind certain words, or the cultural connotation behind certain words that can be put in a negative spin when it was never actually meant to be like that. But anyway, that's a whole other episode. But But I would love to get into, obviously, what is natural sensitivity versus non-natural. However, and I know everyone else is listening and thinking, come on, I want to find out. And I want to find out for me, although I'm fairly confident I'm natural. But before that, could you tell us how you got here? Because I think it's important so that people can understand, like, how did you go down this career path? How did it become sensitivity? How did it become health?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. What a journey. So I'm going to have to start in the womb, right? Like, where else do you start? No, I was a surprise little baby to two precious people that came together, and I came out very sensitive right away. I was a colicky baby. My parents are both really passionate people. I don't know if you know human design at all.
Oh, yes.
Are you into? Okay, cool. I can use that language.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've had a few people on talking about, a few guests on talking about human design. I had Erin Claire Jones not too long ago. So everyone's very familiar with human design if they listen.
Oh, perfect. Okay, perfect. Yeah, wonderful. So both of my parents are manifestors, to give you a concept of how intense that was. And I'm a manifester. So the three of us, and we're all very different manifestors. So it was a potent couple of years with just the three of us. And then you can pray for my siblings. But they did their best, but it was challenging. It was really challenging. I was super sensitive from day one. And so as a result, I kind of entered into the world with this assumption that like something was wrong with me, because my parents they loved me, but they were just like, what is going on? Like, we can't calm you down. We can't, like, one day you're really, happy and fine. Then the next minute you're, screaming bloody murder. And as I grew up, like, that sensitivity remained, but it was very much a negative thing. It was very much like I would go to school and I had really, really, really high expectations for myself. I'm also a 6'2" manifester, emotional authority, of course, in human design, to give that concept for anyone that cares. But it's been a journey of really feeling into the feelings as I became an adult, because when I was young, I rejected. And the first thing that every sensitive does, that I definitely did, was I disconnected from my body immediately. And I turned the volume down on all of the cries and all of the requests, because they were too much, right? Within my culture, within my family, within the world. And what happened is it came into my body. I repressed everything, and it manifested into physical symptoms, which I'd already kind of had because I came into the world with an imbalanced gut microbiome and all sorts of beautiful things. I'll try not to get too nerdy. But I started having a lot of issues. Like, I hit puberty, but my menstruation didn't come. And like, naturally, and I went the Western route and tried all the things, birth control. I was diagnosed with PCOS, hypothyroid, like all the typical things. And nothing worked. Absolutely nothing worked. And I had my best friend, who is on the other side, very natural. Father was a chiropractor, all this, mentioned, hey, why don't you look at food? And this was in college for me. So I'd been going through my whole life just really uncomfortable, sick all the time, barely sleeping because I was just nauseous and all sorts of terrible stuff. And finally, I had someone brilliant say, look at your food. And so I did. And I did an elimination diet way back before it was a thing. No one even knew what that was. I did, which now I wouldn't recommend, but it was a IgG test, which looked at, through blood, like my food sensitivities and all of that, delayed sensitivities. And I was technically, from that testing, sensitive to everything. And I went on what I called the everything free diet, which was my joke, because I literally was like, there's nothing I can eat. I don't even know what to do. So then that really was the initiation point to step into the natural holistic world. And really from there, it was a decade plus of seeing like every kind of practitioner under the sun. Like, I'm not afraid to experiment. I went from, the well-respected integrative doctor all the way to the angel healer. Like, I've seen them all. It's been...
That story's so similar. I love that. I'm just nodding away.
It's been a gamut. Yeah, of course. So, and I loved all of them. Each and every practitioner that I saw was a gift and gave me something, but none of them could actually resolve it. And finally, I came to a place where I just had this hit. I was actually... It's funny because I through all of it, I'm a big researcher. I love to learn. And so I was kind of like gaining a lot of knowledge to the point where I was starting to educate my practitioners. And it really just came to a head where I was like, why am I paying money to tell someone how to treat me? This doesn't feel right. I think it's time, like, I actually go to school and finalize what I know. And then I would love to help other people, because I had a lot of people starting to come to me because I was starting to see results, over time. So I went back to school, and well, I should say before that, I actually had a trip to France, and I was working at a digital marketing agency, which was a horrible fit for me as a highly sensitive. It was like an open concept office, high, fast pace, just lots of pressure. It was my worst nightmare. I only lasted 8 months to give you an idea. It was like so bad. And then we had booked like a year ahead of that, a trip to France. And I was just sitting on the French coast and everything hit, and I knew I had to quit. I was at my wit's end. I was so sick because I had gotten better, and then I got so sick because of lifestyle choices, I'm very passionate about that. And that's really when it hit me. The name actually Mère Fleur came in at that point. This concept of rest that I'm very passionate about came in. And then I knew I was supposed to go back to school. So that kind of initiated it. Then from there, I went to school, got the opportunity to mentor with a lot of amazing people, and dove in deep. I don't do things halfway. I'm like 110% kind of person. And I right away started attracting sensitives. I didn't even know it. I was like, oh, everyone that's coming to me is like an HSP, or like, should know that they're an HSP, or they're finding out they're an HSP through me, or all these different things. And eventually I realized through a few of the clients that weren't, that like, oh yeah, like my work is for sensitives. And so I switched my business model and just like owned it basically. And since then it's been like 4.5 years of just working and specializing in healing sensitives, helping them rebuild and restore their bodies so that they can go out and be their best selves. And over time, that is, grown and grown and deepen and deepen. And now my clients sometimes like, I don't even know what to call you. You're like my naturopath / health coach / therapist / human design expert / like all the things. But it's just because I will learn anything that I think can benefit and can support my sensitive community. Anyone that comes into my practice, like they are my passion and my purpose. And because I know what it feels like to be in so much physical discomfort, and also to just feel so misunderstood. Like I could talk for hours about how I was treated and how I was, and not necessarily by people wanting to be mean, but just having no concept and not knowing what to do with me, And that was just a horrible feeling. And so for me, it's so important that anyone that comes through my work just feels loved and known and understood and respected, and potentially even encouraged and expanded. So
I feel like it is impossible to explain to a non-sensitive person what things feel like sometimes, which, like you say, people misunderstand you and they maybe say things and it's not intentional. But I was trying to explain to someone once, and I was like, how there was a car alarm or something going, and they were like, oh, that's really annoying. And I was like, okay, how that level of like annoyance for you, I was like, it's actually pain for me. Like that actually feels painful to the point that I can't can't focus on anything else. And they were like, oh no, it's just a bit annoying. And I was like, okay, but that's the difference in the depth of processing, right? So, and I also love with your story, like it's such a 6-line story. Like I went through it all myself.
Oh yeah. And it's funny. When I found human design, it was back in 2018. I was like, yes, oh my gosh. And I get, once I feel like I know something, I get bored and I move on pretty quickly if it doesn't like change my life. Human design is one of the few things that I've like maintained my obsession with. That and holistic
so
health.
Much to learn.
Oh my
you
gosh.
can just keep going and going. And, I dip in and out of my chart, and I've got, a couple of people that I've worked with and had readings, and I've got Karen Curry's book, and then I'm reading the Gene Keys, and then I'll just go back and read the basics and see something completely different, like a connection that I'd never made. I'm working on my variables at the moment. So now that I've kind of embraced, anyway, again, this is like a whole other chat that we can have, but I totally feel that. Anyway, thank you for sharing that, because I think it gives people some context to be like, oh, this totally makes sense why you do it, because you've been through a similar experience to, what we have. So the big question, natural sensitivity, how do we know?
So I'm going to give an answer that is going to be frustrating. Only you know.
You just know. I thought you were going to say
That's the truth. And I'll give some helpers, but It's so funny. I was just updating my website and kind of writing out some thoughts on this. But the truth is, this is not a diagnosis. Like, I want to be clear on that. This is not something that needs medical treatment. This is simply an inborn trait that is being studied. There's still so much research to be had. I had an amazing researcher on my podcast, Dr. Bianca, that is still like, her and I got to talk a lot about that there's just so much still to uncover, which is exciting. I think I'm like, oh, someday I want to be a part of that research. But the bottom line is, I think, learning to differentiate between your natural sensitivity and your developed sensitivity. Because here's the thing, most natural sensitives have developed sensitivity as well, because we're human, right? So the way I describe it is, we all have this base, of our sensory processing sensitivity, which I'm sure you've gone into depth on in this podcast, so I won't go too much into that. But over that is our developed sensitivity. Like, we have these layers, and your developed sensitivity it usually, I believe, starts with emotional trauma, right? And if you're into Dr. Gabor at all, his work, yeah, I'm sure.
Yes.
He's been on his podcast tour and his book tour. He's been redefining trauma for a lot of us, which I think is so potent for sensitivity. But the way that he describes it, it's not necessarily like the person or the thing that creates the trauma. It's how you experience the thing or the person. So let's think about that in light of sensitivity. If you have sensory processing sensitivity and you encounter someone that creates an emotional reaction within you, I'll give a more specific example. So in my family, I had 2 siblings. I had myself, my brother, and a sister. And, we all experienced my parents differently. Like, my parents could have said one phrase, and my sister took it one way, my brother took it another, and I took it another way. And that's normal humanity. But underneath mine, I also have my SPS, right? The way that I process. So it took it even deeper. And the way that I received what they said was traumatic in my body. It doesn't matter how anyone else defines it. If a famous psychologist looked at that situation and said, no, there's no way you should have experienced trauma from that. F you, it doesn't matter. Like, if I experienced trauma in my body from that, like, if I had an emotional reaction to that, if my nervous system went into alarm mode, is what I call it, when that phrase was said, regardless of the intention, regardless of the environment, that was trauma for me. So we all have it. And sensitives that have SPS are even more prone, I would say, to having developed sensitivity. So it's kind of interesting because we have both, and so there's that emotional trauma that is kind of unavoidable as children. Even if you have a perfect environment, there's still going to be something, whether it's, a teacher or a coach or, work environment, things like that. Then from that, we develop physical sensitivity. We develop physical trauma, right? So it's the manifestation of our emotional experiences. And that comes out, whether you have a diagnosis or not. It can look like a chronic anxiety, it can look like an autoimmune disease. Like, it doesn't matter. That is developed sensitivity to something, whether you're like, oh, I'm so sensitive to chemicals now, or I can't eat gluten anymore, or whatever it is, right? Like, that is a developed sensitivity. And that's another reason that I really coined this term, is that within my field, sensitivity is being thrown around as a very negative thing that needs to be resolved and fixed, right? Because it is like, the way we define it in the health world is it's an imbalance in the body. That's what a sensitivity is. So I was like, oh, we got to separate these. So if you have that natural sensitivity, you're also going to have, these emotional sensitivities and these body sensitivities that do actually could actually be resolved. And I would encourage you to resolve them. So really, the best way to understand what is developed and what is natural is to work through the physical and the emotional. If you feel comfortable working with a therapist or working with someone you love and trust, to dig in deep and reflect and heal and move through, those traumatic experiences that that happen throughout your life. And then, whether you educate yourself or you work with a practitioner, you start to move through the physical. And then as you do, and you start to build a life that honors your natural sensitivity, it's going to come forward. And it's really interesting because I have a lot of clients now that they've been working with me for a while. And so they're starting to feel like really, really good physically. Like they don't have, I had someone, a precious client that was moving through, I mean, we cleared Lyme, all sorts of things from her body. And she spent decades feeling very ill and sick and not being able to socialize and all these things. And she's absolutely a sensitive, natural sensitive. And she's redefining herself because she's like, oh, I thought that thing was a part of my natural sensitivity, but it was actually developed. So now that I've cleared it, I'm almost like confused. Like, am I no longer sensitive? It's like, no, you are. It's just,
but it's going to show up in a good way now.
It's show up in a good way. Now that you're healthy, it looks different. You are still going to feel so much more than the person next to you that doesn't have natural sensitivity. That's never going away. But like I said at the beginning, you can dial up or dial down. You can turn the volume up on your sensitivity or you can turn it down in a good way. And that you can really overactivate is a word I like to use, your sensitivity, or you can have a nice, calm, peaceful, balanced life that honors and respects your unique needs as a sensitive. And then you actually will thrive even more than someone, still secret. Like when we're in the right environment, we actually excel more than someone that doesn't have our trait. So that's like a major bonus, is that we can really do well in multiple areas of life if we just live differently. So does that help a little bit?
Totally.
I know it's still tough to navigate because there's that desire to know, but the best thing I would say is to begin gently and slowly moving through the layers that you can identify, and the fog will begin to clear. You might have a few moments of redefining yourself and going, wait, who am I? But that's a part of the journey. And I think when you're in the fog and you really want to know if you have like SPS, for example, sensory processing sensitivity, the best way to look at it is any question, any quiz. There's a million quizzes out there of like, oh, are you an HSP? Blah, blah, blah. When you answer those questions, would you have said that those applied from birth? Like that would be a really good way to identify. Where like for me, I'm fortunate that's very easy. My parents are like, yeah, you were. And, this was really like from day one, so I don't have any question, but for some people, they're like, I don't, my parents just kind of like glazed over my childhood, or I'm not in connection with my parents. So it can be hard to know. But if your memories, as far back as you can go, and a lot of us have a hard time with remembering our childhood as sensitives, but as far back as you can go, if you remember just feeling overwhelmed, if you remember feeling like, oh, everyone else is responding very calmly to an environment that I feel very activated by, that's usually a sign. If it's something that happened later where you're like, oh, I was totally fine, then all of a sudden, I started, my sense of smell really heightened, or I suddenly couldn't eat all these foods and just hit me out of nowhere, like that's developed sensitivity. That's not necessarily. And of course, there's rare, situations where people are just in such deep denial they don't know. But ultimately, when you're in that fog, those are the ways to kind of differentiate. So I hope that helps.
I know for me, I always remember, like as way back as I can remember, I hated being in synthetic clothes. I hated that feeling of synthetic and static. And I also hated, and this actually like makes me cringe inside, if I wore socks or you don't call them tights, do you? Pantyhose.
Yeah.
Tights. With a seam in the and the things like bright lights, being in I remember going to gymnastics class and being in those fluorescent lights. As way back as I can remember, I always really, really hated those things. So then when I came to understand, I didn't know what highly sensitive meant until I was almost 40. But once I had learned that and understood, and I could definitely see, some ways in my adult life, as you say, it had been developed. But I looked back and I was like, no, this is a physical thing. Like I definitely had this when I was a kid.
That's a perfect example. So helpful. Yeah. And I will say this too. Every sensitive is different. And so like, just because one sensitive has, a strong reaction to fluorescent lighting, say I don't, which I do, but say I don't, it doesn't mean that I'm not a sensitive all of a sudden. We all have our own things because we're all unique that really, really overactivate us.
Yeah.
And a perfect example for me that I always give is I've always had a crazy nose on me. Like I can smell a peanut butter and jelly sandwich from like a mile away. I could tell you it's coming. Like I know it's there.
And that's a good trait to have.
Yeah. And, it's there. And I, from a health perspective, if I was hearing that purely with my practitioner cap on, I'd be like, okay, liver, gallbladder backup. Like there's things going on. But the thing is even once I clear that, yes, my sensitivity around my sense of smell might decrease like a little bit, but it's still in comparison to the regular person, like up here, and that's another big like way to know is if it maintains even after. But everyone's different. It's important to not get too caught up in the nitty-gritty, which can be hard for some of us because a lot of us have really high expectations, have a tendency towards obsession because we want to know. And so it's tough. It is, but that is a part of our journey, I think, as sensitives is learning to relax into our bodies, which can be really, really hard in this world, but learning how to do that within the chaos that's around us, whether that's knowledge, whether that's people, whether that's traffic, whether that's emotions, whatever it is swirling around us. I think that's the key is learning how to come back into our body, remember who we are, and then have the courage to stand up or own what it is that we need and to live into that as much as possible.
I think that is a beautiful sentiment to wrap up on. I couldn't think of a better way to conclude all of that. So, Jessi, thank you so much. I'm going to drop all of your links in the show notes. So if anyone wants to come over and connect with you and learn more about you, they can find everything there. But of course, before I let you go, I'm going to ask for your book recommendation for my ambitiously introverted, sensitive audience who are looking to start, grow, or scale their business.
It's funny. I thought of this book in the beginning and it's staying with me. So I'm just going to say it. The Myth of Normal, by Dr. Gabor, like his new book that just came out. I just finished it. I have a book club with sensitives, the Natural Sensitive Book Club. We're very fresh, but it's been fun. And that book, it is a beefy one. Like it is not light. And I will say this too. There's some chapters I actually completely disagreed with, but there's so much goodness in it about trauma, developed trauma, that I think that is really, really important for us as sensitives to understand because it's hard for us to live out our natural sensitivity when we're weighed down by our developed trauma. And so I think that's a big part of healing. And his new book kind of encompasses all his other books. So if you've ever been interested in his work, which is all about trauma, that is the book to read. As I said, it's a beefy one. Maybe do the Audible version.
Be in really small segments.
Small segments, yeah. And like walk along the ocean or whatever is your peaceful place as you listen to it. Because, it is a lot of deep thoughts. Like I could chew on that book for decades probably. But it's got some really, really powerful information. So I hope that's helpful.
You touched on something there that I'm just going to say, because this is how I read. Like quite often I read a lot of books, like probably 2 to 3 a week. And I don't always agree with everything in them. And I think there's so much of trusting your intuition and going, no, that doesn't feel good. I'm just going to leave it there and actually taking the parts that you agree with and learning something. And I'm really glad you said that book because we touched on it earlier. I was going to actually say, I'll drop the link to Dr. Gabor Mate in the show notes as well. But now we have the link to his book. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
It's so great to talk to you.
Oh, you too. Thank you for having me on, Emma.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ambitious Introvert podcast with me, Emma-Louise Parks. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on iTunes. As a thank you, one lucky reviewer each month will win a 60-minute one-on-one coaching session with me, where you'll get the clarity and confidence to attract your ideal clients. And if you know someone who could benefit from listening to the show, then please do share and help me reach as many fellow ambitious introverts as possible.